what's our guiding principle? Is it customer first? Is it low cost? Is it incredible level of service? Is it innovation? Whatever it is, but there should be one driving force.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with various BPM practitioners from all around the world. Today, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Michael zur Muehlen. Michael is an associate professor at Stevens Institute of Technology. And I just want to read this, one of the lines he has in his About section on LinkedIn, because I feel like it sums it up quite well what he does. He's an academic and practitioner that studies the design, implementation, and improvement of processes and decisions. And we're going to dive into this. I've got a number of topics that I'm excited to dive into and cover today. So Michael, thanks for sitting down and joining me today.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, that was obviously a very brief introduction to who you are and what you do. One thing that my audience is always interested to know is, how did you first get into BPM? When was it first introduced to you? And take us on a journey leading up to what you're doing today.
Sure. I grew up in Germany, and like many Germans, we like to follow the rules and we like order. And so process is something that's sort of genetically imbued in us. And at university, I studied information systems. And I remember it was around 1993 or so, one of the faculty members put a stack of disks on my desk and said, "Hey, we've got this system here that IBM donated to us. It's called Flowmark. Can you figure out what this is?" And it was one of the early workflow management systems, not one of the very first generation, but part of the tools that came up in the early 1990s. So I started looking at it, and one of the things I was interested in was how different workflow systems represented organizations, how they mapped processes. So I made that part of my master's thesis. And that was combined with some work in the consulting field, where we helped organizations understand their own process landscape. We did some large-scale modeling projects in Germany. And then once I got my PhD, I got the opportunity to move to the United States to start at Stevens. And I've kept one foot in the academic side and one foot in the practitioner side, as you mentioned. So I had the opportunity to engage with a standards organization called the Workflow Management Coalition early on. And this organization put together some interoperability standards for how modeled processes would be ingested by workflow systems, how workflow systems would talk to each other, how the audit trail, or the, I guess now we call it the digital exhaust of a process, would look like.
Right.
And I stayed engaged with them for a good 10 years or so and got to know a lot of the different workflow vendors along the way. So through that led to some engagements in the United States with some large organizations. So I helped bring the BPMN modeling standard into the Department of Defense. And then that led to an engagement with Goldman Sachs on standing up a process organization there. And once you start working with one financial organization, others follow. So I've worked with some of the really large and well-known banks, as well as the public sector, so the Federal Reserve of New York and the Veterans Administration on process standards. So in a nutshell, that's the journey so far.
That's great. And so you've been part of setting up teams of process practitioners for various organizations. I think that's one thing that different organizations that I encounter or come across is that oftentimes it is quite scattered, the governance or the control of the way they manage their processes. It's split up across departments, or it's done in small areas. How important is it to have a central process team that is working on processes from an enterprise-wide level?
I think it depends very much on the culture of the organization. So there are, let me just illustrate it with an example. The Department of Defense is, of course, very centrally organized because there's a very clear chain of command. And the culture is such that if you're on the civilian side, you're not going to do anything unless there's a very clear instruction for you to do so, and there's a mandate for you to do so. So when we brought BPMN in as a notation, the actual act of convincing people that processes should be documented in this way was not very hard. But to cross the T's and dot the I's and make sure that there were policies in place that said, okay, if you're acquiring a system, the processes of the system should be described in BPMN. That took a good 3 years to write the instructions, the memos, get all the sign-offs for it, and to put this into place. Once that was in place, the people that built systems for the Department of Defense said, well, that's great that we have this mandate now, but who's going to teach us how to do it? So we had to stand up a training program and build out education for contractors and the people that design systems to make this a self-sustaining effort. So there, the focus was on putting central guidance in place. And then fast forward financial sector, the first big bank that I worked with had a very entrepreneurial culture and was very fast, very Wall Street, or Wolf of Wall Street, like I should say. So in that sense, what was surprising was that the first thing we had to put in place were guidelines and governance structure around the process effort, because if we hadn't done that, everybody would have picked this new concept or this new construct and run off in different directions to the extent that their imagination allowed them to do so. So we had to build in guardrails. And that was something that we didn't have to do at all in the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense has built-in guardrails already. And so there you have to keep pushing the initiative along. You have to set a flagpole at the edge of the horizon and say, you know, this is the marching direction, and then bring the organization along. But in a different culture on Wall Street, there's a lot of agility. And as soon as you can show your first win, everybody gets this idea that, oh, this is good. I want some of this. How can we scale this very quickly? And so there, I think it was more important than to put standards in place and governance in place so that the effort did not fizzle out. I'm currently working with an organization that is very federated. So they have one central headquarters in a European country, but they've got operations in Asia and operations in the US. And every single part of this organization is operating fairly independent of each other. So I think there the effort is going to be to start with a small team that has very, very clear ideas on how to build a process repository, how to put process owners in place, and build the standards such that the other parts of the organizations can replicate that, but then run that under their own guidance. So back to your question, right? How important is it to have a small team and then scale out? I think it's good to start with a small team of experts so that you can get guidance in place, so that you can define who can initiate the review of a process, who is accountable for results of process. Because many organizations don't even have this concept of a process owner in place. And it's a very big cultural shift to put ownership in place for something that is so ephemeral as a process. And then you scale from there, right? So in one bank, we started with 3 people. And then at the end of the effort, we had 1,600 people trained. And we had process as a core part of the onboarding of new associates. So everybody that joined the bank went through a process training as part of their first week in the bank. And that ultimately allowed it to become ingrained in the culture. But it started with 3 people.
Yes, yeah, that's great. And when you're talking about process ownership, it's something that came up last week for me, actually, where I was talking to an organization, a telecommunications company, and they were saying, how do we define process owners? There's so many different definitions or ways about going about it out there. How do we, I guess, identify these process owners? How do we empower them? How do we put this in place so that this process won't just sit there collecting dust, but someone actually takes responsibility for it, and responsibility for it when it's not performing well?
I think the the concept of process owners is highly correlated to the maturity of the organization in the way how it looks at its processes. So if you have a very immature organization, very functionally oriented, you've got these silos, the performance is managed by function, and things are just handed off, thrown over a wall, and then it's the problem of the next function. Bringing process owners in is difficult. So you may have to bring your overall business process management maturity up a level, get this shared understanding that there are processes that cross boundaries and that this coordination between functions needs to be coordinated in order to create performance benefits, I should say.
Right.
And these performance benefits can then lead to performance expectations, and somebody needs to be accountable for these expectations, and that's the role of the process owner. But we talk a lot about process owners without having a clear understanding of what it is that the process owners actually do, or what it is that they are accountable for. And that requires a lot of thought, because if you are responsible for an end-to-end process in an organization that has functional management, you will have some say over the work that people do in a function that you may not belong to, or that is managed by somebody else.
Right.
So that creates conflict. And you're probably not going to completely resolve this conflict. So process ownership is really powerful if you can clearly articulate what's in it for the people that sit in the individual functions, right? The process owner needs to be able to articulate what's the benefit of me looking after this process.
Yes.
And the authority of the process owner could be to initiate a review of the process, or to standardize the design of a process across different lines of business or for different products. It can go all the way to P&L responsibility for businesses that are affected by the process, but I've seen this more in industrial organizations than in service organizations.
Yes, right.
It really depends on what the guiding principle is, how the organization is driven, right? Is it by product? Are you shifting atoms? Are you shifting bits? Is the customer at the center? Are you providing services? All of these things play a role there.
Yes, yeah, right. And there'll be people listening to our conversation right now that are from organizations that don't have a very high level of process maturity. What are the challenges they may face as they adopt and implement BPM? Obviously, there's probably many challenges that you could talk about for hours, but I guess for people would be interested to know, well, what are the red flags we should be watching out for as we embark on this journey?
So I think you can see the maturity of the organization very clearly when you look at how problems are being managed in the organization. So do you have a team of firefighters that run towards the problem or jump on the hand grenade before it blows up? That's a good indication that the maturity of the organization isn't particularly high if you have heroes in the organization. Right? A very process-driven organization has clear accountabilities and clear responsibilities and does systematic reviews of the way how it does business. I was just listening to a podcast on Peter Collins, who may not be a household name for many people. He was the manager of Formula One teams in the 1980s. He worked for Lotus and then for Benetton. And one of the things that he said was that the things that he enjoyed most was to create standard operating procedures and processes for these teams. When he joined Benetton, in the first race, he just observed what everybody did. And they qualified 18th or so in a field of 20 cars. Then he put some standard procedures in place, and in the next race they qualified 9th, and in the race after that they put the car on pole position with the same drivers, same car, same engineers, same pit crew. So it's great if the organization has a single objective, as in this case, put the driver across the finish line before everybody else. In many organizations, there could be some confusion, or maybe not confusion, but there could be some conflict around what the objectives of the organization actually are.
Right.
And if you don't have clarity of what your objectives are, then it's going to be really difficult to manage your processes accordingly. So that's, I think organizations that are at a low level of maturity should probably start by saying, what's our guiding principle? Is it customer first? Is it low cost? Is it, an incredible level of service? Is it innovation? Whatever it is, but there should be one driving force, and it can't be everything. Right? Francis Fry from Harvard has famously said, if you want to be excellent at something, you have to decide to suck at something else. So you can't be great at everything.
Yes,
so if you want to be great at something, what are you not going to be great at? What's your trade-off that you decide? And many organizations are not willing to make the trade-off. They say, oh, we're going to be great at everything. And then they're going to be mediocre at everything.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. And in like that example of the that car racing team where they improved over a very few races and went from 18th to 1st, do you have examples or stories of organizations where they've improved their process? They've, I guess, taken a sat back, observed what's going on, improved their processes, and likewise, they've gone from 18th position to 1st position in the way that they are delivering value as an organization?
Yeah, I think that the first thing that you need to remember is when you introduce business process management into an organization, it's not an overnight change. It takes a while to show results. But I think one of the ways how it shows results is that you are more systematic at realizing new opportunities. So I have a bank I've worked with that stood up an organization in the area of asset and wealth management, change mobilization organization that is doing everything that's currently on the books with regard to automation. So they do process automation, they do robotic process automation, so desktop automation, they do decision services, they're starting with process mining, and they very systematically legged into this. So they built capability after capability after capability up. And the result is that they are seeing dramatic improvements in every project that they now tackle. So customer-facing processes where the cycle time goes from 6 months down to days, or from 2 weeks down to hours. Right. And it's I think if you look at the magnitude of improvement that this organization has shown, and they've done this for about 2 years now, that for me is a great proof of how they've matured in their ability to deploy both process thinking as well as process technologies.
That's great. And I guess for someone that's listening right now, and they're, that maybe their organization is at an earlier stage of their maturity, but they're hearing about technology like a robotic process automation or process mining. I know that sometimes there can be an attraction to just grab onto technology and shove it in and see if it works because it's working for that company over there. What are the foundations you need to get in place, or I guess what do you need to think through before pulling process mining in, as an example?
So process mining is an interesting concept. There are some excellent firms out there that offer process mining software these days. Some of them have billion-dollar valuations. And I think as a technology, it has matured tremendously. The precondition to do effective process mining is that you have to have a question that you're after. So right. One of the vendors talks about a performance gap. So there's the theoretical performance of how well you could be, or how good you could be, and there's the actual performance of how well you're actually performing.
Right.
And mining the traces or the digital exhaust of your processes gives you the as is, and then you can think about, how do I manage the gap? How do I get better? And you can use then other techniques like simulation, what if scenarios in order to say, well, what would happen if I shifted people around, or what would happen if I automated this part of the process? So you have to have a question that you're after in order to be effective at deploying this. That's one. And then the other is, of course, you have to have the data available. And organizations that are starting out in the business process space, they're typically data poor,
Right.
meaning that there are not a lot of traces available that you can look at, or if there are traces, they have a fairly limited range from start to end. So you may have a high fidelity picture about a very small part of the organization, but there are huge blind spots. And so
Right,
your
right.
process might look like an iceberg. You see the tip above the waterline, but then 2/3 of it under the waterline are still murky and miraculous.
Yes, right.
Yeah. So if an organization is thinking about bringing a technology in, I think in most organizations that I've worked with, the first step was just to map out the processes. And mapping in itself, it shouldn't be an activity that you do just because you like process mapping, right? Only Germans do that. You should map processes again because you're trying to answer some questions. And
Yes.
This is where my prop comes in here. So this book here, sorry, it goes a little blurry, is from 1932 by Fritz Nordsieg, and it's his dissertation on how to create pictures on how organizations work. And it has the first flow charts and the first process models in it. So we've done this for 90 years.
Yes.
And all we've done in 90 years is basically take vertical flow charts and flip them 90 degrees. So now we have horizontal BPMN diagrams.
Right.
But what we're really doing is we're making coordination visible. And the thing about coordination is you don't see coordination and you don't think about coordination unless or until it's absent, until it breaks.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's like walking down the street. You don't think about your biomechanical movements unless you trip and fall. And then all of a sudden it becomes clear that coordination has failed.
Yes.
So the job of the process modeler is then to tease out what does the coordination look like between people, between teams, between systems. And then you can start systematically evaluating that and saying, okay, what can I do to make that better? But we're coming back to the question of what's the question I'm after? What does better really mean? Does better mean cheaper? Does better mean more compliant? Does better mean less risky? Does better mean in a more innovative or more customer-friendly way? Right? That's the question that you need to answer at the very beginning. What does better mean for you? Yes. And then we've got the tools and the techniques and the software that you can throw at that problem. And if you do it in an intelligent fashion, you're going to see results.
Yes, yes. And when you're looking at making things better or closing that performance gap, as you were talking about, when do you, obviously there's a part of process improvement, tweaking a process to be able to shave off some seconds or cut down on resources or whatever it might be. And then you've got the other side of the equation, I guess, which is doing more radical innovation, which is, I guess, putting that process to the side altogether. And then how can we approach this in a new, totally different, totally new way, different way that hasn't been done before? I guess we've seen that with a lot of the startups that in the last 10, 15 years that have really disrupted entire industries because there are people entering these industries with very little experience from that particular industry. Like we could look at the Ubers or the Airbnbs or those types of organizations. And I guess when they come in, they have a totally different way of thinking about how can we deliver value in this realm, in this sphere. So when, I guess going back to the point or the question, when do you incrementally improve a process? When do you radically innovate and transform something?
I think you have the opportunity to do both. It depends on the organizational setup, of course. If you are an established organization, you need to keep the lights on and you need to keep the trains on time. You get to produce, but the fundamental of business is we articulate value, we create value, we transact value. Those are the three things that we do. And now, the digital era brings a lot of changes in terms of how we do this, how we can create value. And startups like fintech startups or insurtech startups, I think they can begin by taking a very narrow view on what value proposition they are looking to improve. So is it personal transportation? Is it lending, peer-to-peer lending? Or in the case of, say, Lemonade, an insurtech startup, like how does renters insurance look like? How easy or hard is it to sign up for something like that? So, so you start with a very narrow value proposition. You can then build ideal processes around that. You can build ideal technology around that. And what these startups often do is they shift the boundary between what businesses traditionally did and what the customer is now able to do, because we have our smart devices and we have browsers, and we don't carry a lot of technology debt with us if we are building a startup.
Yes.
Existing businesses have a lot of technology debt. They've got millions of investments in their existing infrastructure. They've got people in their organization, and they need to think about what do the career paths for these people look like. And you can't just swap out an entire organization by shifting people around and then hiring new ones that may have the skills that you want. So that's where the incrementalism has a place. But there are established organizations that are creating incubators or that are doing internal startups that are giving parts of the organization a mandate to say, okay, reimagine what this process can look like. Right. And I think the challenge is to give these ventures a long enough runway so they can actually get to the delivery of value. And then at some point, you can switch things over. So case in point, Amazon had a technology decision that they made around 2000. Jeff Bezos reportedly made it and said, everything that we're going to do is build in services, right? And we're going to build these services in a way that the team that builds a service is also the team that runs the service. So if it breaks, I'm going to get you out of bed in 2 a.m. to make sure that you fix it.
Yes.
As a result, whether you have a buy it now button in an app or on the website, or have an Amazon Dash button, or you use Alexa, it all uses the same purchasing service in their backend. Now, established retailers like Walmart didn't have that luxury. They had established information systems, merchandise management systems, and so on. And at a certain point then, Amazon was doing some quite interesting innovations, but Walmart had done some interesting innovations, but hadn't quite shifted their entire technology infrastructure to this new world of working. So what they did is they acquired Jet.com, which was a retail startup with very, very sophisticated technology. And now Walmart's e-commerce division is being run by the Jet.com people, and it's flowing back into their traditional operation. Right. So you sometimes have an opportunity to reinvent yourself by either growing such a startup inside, or buying one of these established startups and then showing the willingness to change the way how you do business by letting that startup lead your way.
Yes, right. And I guess that's a big part of it, even if it's whether you're acquiring a startup and bringing them on board to, I guess, continue this innovative approach, or whether you want to incrementally improve a process internally, I guess you do want to empower people to bring their own thoughts and suggestions to the table, especially those process performers or process participants that are on the front lines carrying out the process. They're probably in a pretty good position to identify what's broken in this process? How could we do this better? And if there isn't that opportunity for them to bring their ideas to the table, then that organization could be missing out on a lot of value there.
That's right. Frontline workers, process participants do have a lot of insight in what works and what doesn't work. And if you educate them and give them easy enough to use tools so that they can lead a conversation, then you're going to see a tremendous value. So in one of the banks that I mentioned, what we've done is there's a fairly lightweight, or I guess now we would say low code workflow environment. And we've empowered line of business representatives to build out easy workflows for processes that were currently Excel over email or generally email driven. And it's been a tremendous learning experience for everybody, for the line of business, because they've learned how to look at their problems so that they can actually be converted into technology, but also for the central team. So there's a center of excellence that is holding hands during these efforts. And as the center of excellence, we've learned the problems that people bring to us and the thoughts that they have about what they would like to see at the process. And some of these things are not process problems. So that's, right. I think that's one of the things that it often gets overlooked. You know, BPM is very broad. You can apply it to many issues, but not all issues are process issues.
Right.
And in the ideal world, I'd like to have a team that understands when something is a process problem, when something is a decision problem, when something is a customer experience problem, when something is a data problem. So being able to articulate what the differences are is one thing. And then when somebody comes to you with an issue and they'd like a solution for it, the answer shouldn't be, well, that's not a process problem, so we can't solve that.
Right.
The answer should be, well, this might not be a process problem, but it's a decision problem. And so here's the complementary approach and technology that will help you solve that exact problem.
Yes, right. That's great.
So the potential at the moment that I see is there's this interplay between process automation, workflow, robotic process automation, and decision-making on the other side. And so we used to have a world of business rules. FICO and other firms were building business rules engines that were deployed at large scale to make decisions such as, should I approve this loan, or can I authorize this credit card transaction?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the business rules people were of the opinion that the world consists of rules and I don't need anything else. As long as I describe all the rules, I can solve everything.
Right.
The process people on the other side thought, well, the world is a collection of activities that depend on each other. And if I describe all the activities and the dependencies between them, then I can solve everything, right? So never the twain shall meet. And it's been over the past 8-9 years that we've learned that these two worlds not only can coexist rather peacefully with each other, but they can complement each other.
Right.
Because if I start looking at a process with a question, what's the decision that is being made in this process? Then I don't start, what's the trigger? What's the first step? What's the next step? What's the next step? I start at the end and I say, okay, what's the decision at the end? What are the possible outcomes?
Right.
And what are the inputs that I need in order to make this decision? What's the data that I need? And my process becomes a vehicle to acquire this data, to validate this data, and then to bring it into a decision service where all the logic sits that says, okay, what interest rate do I charge for this? What fee schedule is applicable? Can I authorize this loan or not? And it makes the process design much simpler, and it isolates changes in the decision logic from changes in the process.
Yes.
Because we find that decisions change with much higher frequency than processes really change.
Right.
I want to tweak my approval criteria. I want to adjust the credit score that makes the discrimination between an approved loan and a not approved loan.
Yes.
That happens all the time. But I don't want to go into my BPMN diagram and change the routing and change the parameters on the arrows. Because there's too much change effort involved in that.
Yes, yeah. And when talking about, I guess, getting buy-in for business process management or getting sponsorship, getting, I guess, support from senior leadership to, I guess, invest in that area with finances, with resources to, I guess, value it and give it some legs to grow, build momentum. How does one go about pitching that value or articulating that value? And I know there's a number of different thoughts out there about whether you should even consider going from a top-down approach, whether you should build value, prove value on a smaller scale. But I guess what's your take on that in getting senior leaders on board with the idea of BPM, especially in an organization where it's not being driven by the top down?
Well, I think you have to figure out what makes the senior leaders tick or what keeps them up at night. Ultimately, BPM is a tool. It's a means to an end. And you have to understand what the end is. So when we articulate the benefit of business process management, we always want to articulate this in the context of the problem that senior management is interested in solving. So if we're talking about a financial institution, did you get a matter requiring immediate attention from your regulator because one of your processes was broken? Then your articulation is, well, we need business process management because there are too many risks here. The controls don't seem to be adequate. We need to understand what this process looks like. BPM is an approach to instill this discipline, and it can solve this problem for us. If we have an issue where we're losing market share because the competition is picking up our customers because they're dissatisfied with our service delivery, then the argument for business process management would be, well, we need to understand the customer journey. We need to figure out where we can use automation to shorten the wait times for our clients, or our ability to better understand how to serve them. And so it's a different narrative there. So you understand what the problem is that we're solving would be the first step. And it doesn't always work. I have had projects that were initiated at the highest level. So Department of Defense, it was the chief technology officer that says, okay, I want this process approach. I'm going to give the team the resources to do this. It was a very successful effort. At a different organization, the senior manager had seen a process effort succeed at his prior organization. And so he came into this new organization and I said, I'm going to replicate this. I want this. So we had top management support. We came in and it was an absolute disaster because we underestimated the inertia of the culture of the organization. Basically, people crossed their arms and they said, well, you want to change the process? Make me. And there was no buy-in for this effort whatsoever. And there did not seem to be a carrot or a stick that would make people move. So that effort was abandoned after half a year. So to the point, senior management buy-in is important to give you the resources in the long run, but it's not an automatic guarantee of success because culture eats strategy for breakfast, as we know. And so, you want to do this in a way that meshes with the culture of the organization and that makes people want to contribute and want to buy in.
Yes, great. And what's the carrot for the process performers or the process participants? Because as we've been talking about, they are the ones carrying out the process, and in some cases, they're the ones that have been doing this process or this sequence of activities for the last 2, 3, 5, 10 years of their employment. And so we're coming in there saying, hey, I think there's a better way, depending on the personality of these people and I guess the culture of the organization, that needs to be done well and carefully. I guess the change management to bring them on board and get them to be I guess, interested in these changes as opposed to being, as you were saying there, sort of sit back, arms folded. So what's the carrot for process performers?
Well, the main message is that work is not going to look the same 2, 3, or 5 years from now. There are changes afoot that don't just have to do with process, but we have artificial intelligence, data-driven decision-making through big data analytics, and pervasive automation that's just going to have a massive impact on the way how people work. I think there's a way to bring this in a way where you say, I'm going to take the less pleasurable aspects of your work and we're going to automate those. And that's where robotic process automation often comes in. So when RPA first started, people were looking at this and say, well, you're just papering over a broken process to begin with. Why don't you fix the process once and for all?
Right.
And the truth is that fixing a process is resource intensive. So sometimes it may not be worth a large scale effort, but automating in the small scale takes a lot of pain points away, and it gives people time and capacity to think about the larger scale changes that they may want to see. So, so everybody has aspects of their job that they like doing and aspects of the job that they don't like doing. And articulating the effect of robotic process automation or business process management, say, okay, how is that going to make your life better? So how am I going to take the things away that currently tie you up? Invariably, there are going to be changes. And, when you want people to change, you have to figure out what motivates them, what drives them, right? What's the incentive, or the what's in it for me question. And, if I've seen some organizations that are extremely well managed, where the senior manager says, I'm sitting in your seat and I'm just keeping it warm until you're ready to take it.
Right.
And that's a very powerful message, because it gives people the idea, okay, there is a pathway for me in this organization. There's a way forward, and I know where to go.
Yeah.
If you're in an organization where that, let's call it an upgrade path, is not clear, then and people are just holding on to the positions until they have to leave, you're dealing with a very different situation.
Yes. Yeah.
There's also an art to celebrating wins when you run process projects. And I think one of the people that I would bring on board a project as early as I can afford it is a public relations person that can write up the success stories and say, okay, here's what we did, and here are all the benefits that we created for our customers and internally. And we're talking about the customer experience and the employee experience, and say, how does BPM make the employee experience better?
Yes, right.
So that can go a long way.
Yes, yeah, that's great. And when we're looking towards the future now, so the next 2, 3, 5 years, where do you feel like organizations, and this is quite broad and general because every organization is at a different maturity level, but where would you encourage organizations to be investing their time, effort, and energy over the next 2, 3, 5 years when it comes to BPM?
So the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, is what William Gibson once said, right? So there are, of course, some organizations that are, further up on the maturity curve. They have figured out approaches that work for them. I would encourage organizations to have a look at the portfolio of technologies that exist in the BPM space and see which of these are quick wins for them. And there are some things that are being pitched by analysts, that are being pitched by well-known organizations that put up quadrants or triangles or squares and say, you need this technology because it's going to be really important. But is this technology right for you at this level of your maturity? Is a big question, right? To your earlier question about process mining, there's a great interest in process mining. And if you talk to the process mining vendors, everybody needs process mining. But it may not be the first tool in the process space that you want to engage with. It's right for some firms, it's not right for others. For some firms, it might be right to look at robotic process automation first. And there is task mining as a complement to process mining, where you put a little agent on the desktop and you record what happens, and you use that as input to a robotic process automation initiative.
Yes, right.
I think documenting processes is still a very baseline skill that organizations can benefit from. And I've seen process repositories grow to large numbers of artifacts that are in those repositories. And there was always the question when I dealt with organizations that said, well, I see all these process models. I have thousands of process models in my repository, but a lot of them were created and then they were never touched again. And then there were a handful that were touched 50 times or 100 times that were continually improved. And my answer to them is that's completely normal.
Right.
Sometimes you have these one-off process models because you need to create a shared understanding between operations and technology, between the sales office and the engineering office in terms of how things work. So you create the model, everybody looks at it, says, okay, I know now what's going on. And then you put this model aside. It doesn't become the basis to build something, but it facilitates the conversation. Right. And then there are other models that you build and you want to turn them into a solution. You want to turn them into software. Then you need to apply other standards to them. Then you need to apply more engineering standards. They need to be more robust. They need to be more accurate. They need to be scalable. They need to take into account the features of the platform that you want to deploy these models onto. So understand that pictures are being drawn for different purposes, and so different design standards apply to these pictures.
Yes, right.
So an organization that's starting out, that thinks they're at a relatively low level of business process maturity, I would say dip your toe in the water with a bounded project. So find an area where it hurts, where you think you have a process problem, and do a proof of concept. And ideally take the proof of concept beyond just the process model. Take a low-code platform and build an alternative to your I sent you an Excel spreadsheet over Outlook process that currently exists.
Yeah.
And see what that does for the organization, right? And then iterate over that. I think that's the hardest thing for many organizations these days, just to get into this mode of continual releases.
Yes.
We are, if I ask you which version of Zoom we're currently using, I probably would have to, look at the drop down, and I wouldn't know what the version number is that we're currently on, but I know that they push out a new version almost on a weekly basis.
Yes, right.
And the new version has new features and it makes life better.
Yes.
So where's the release management for our business processes? Right? Where do we push out a new version of our process in a systematic fashion?
Right.
So that it becomes almost invisible to the users or the frontline workers in the process. But all of a sudden there is a data validation on a field where currently no data validation existed, or there's an external service that, validates your zip code that currently didn't exist, right? So these incremental changes, when we push them out on a regular basis, and we think about our processes as living and continually improving things, that would be the ideal state of process maturity.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. And for someone that's listening to this or listening to our conversation, and maybe they've heard about business process management in the past, but for whatever reason they don't have the best experience with it, or they haven't heard the best things about it because their organization didn't approach it well, didn't set it up well, didn't have right process ownership or governance, or didn't have the adequate resources to, I guess, implement it well. But you've sparked some ideas in their mind and they want to learn more about this topic or this area. Where do they go to learn more? For someone that's in an organization, they value process, they want to see what value it can bring. Where do you go to learn more about this topic, and I guess to glean from what other people are doing? So, of course, there's this video podcast series, right? Where you've interviewed many people that have brought lots of knowledge to bear. So I would say, go and look at what Will van der Aals and Michael Roseman and, others, Roger Trigger, have to say about business process management and how to go about it. There are some really good books, and some of these books are older. There is a book that I still use in my teachings by Gary Rumler, Managing the White Space of the Organization. It's a really classic book, but it talks about the parts of the organization where stuff falls through the cracks, and how you should manage this part, right? Also, Paul Harmon wrote a really good book on business process change a couple of years ago. It's come out in newer editions. So from a practitioner perspective, those are two things I like. Yes.
Software has become a lot more accessible, a lot easier to use. There are open source workflow systems. There's Camunda, there's Flowable, Bonita Soft. I don't really want to point out one more than the other. But there's a lot of software where if you go through a tutorial and they let you build something that you can then run, once you click that run button, you get an aha moment about what this actually can do for you and can do for your organization. And that will bring out the creativity to say, there might be new things that I can generate. Those are three things where I would start. There are, of course, websites and conferences. There's an international conference on business process management on the academic side. That's great for the academics. For the practitioners, I think I would start with those two books. And then, as I said, you have all the bright minds of business process management that you've already interviewed. There are many great ideas in those conversations as well.
That's great. That's fantastic. Well, Michael, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me and sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us. I think the stories that you've been able to share are absolutely fascinating. And I think that's, I guess it brings BPM to life when you can see how it's been working for other organizations, what challenges have been faced and how have those challenges been overcome. I've certainly been learning a lot, and I know that our audience is going to learn a lot from this episode as well. So on behalf of the community, thank you for sitting down with me today.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been a real pleasure.